Asato ma satagamaya tamaso maham jyotirgamaya mrityurmam amritam gamaya avir maedhi Rudra yate dakshinam mukha tena maham pahi nityam. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality, and reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. So my subject this morning is the knife, fork, and spoon of Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga is a way of spiritualizing everyday life. It enables us to do our ordinary activities in such a way that it will lift our minds inward and upward and be conducive to our spiritual self-liberation. Today, we are jivas. We are bound souls. We live in Maya, this world of Maya, the world of suffering. All of our suffering is due to our karma, that is, our self-conscious volitional actions. Every time you do an action motivated by attachment, with a personal desire for the fruits of the action, it lays down a samskara, an impression in the psyche, which generates a habit and puts us into a cycle of repetition compulsion. We could call it the vicious circle of karma. And we could visualize it as like a cycle, like a turning. And every time we do an action, we forge another cycle that is like another link in the chain that binds us. Each one of these links, these cycles, is like a wheel. And there are wheels within wheels of this great world machine. This world is a terrible machine. It's governed by the law of cause and effect, by action and reaction. We cannot escape from the wheels of the world machine. As long as we live on the earth, we have to act. We have to engage in intense activity. We can't fly away from the wheels of the world machine. Therefore, we have to learn to stand inside it and to learn the secret of work. And by work here, we're translating the word karma. Karma is translated as action, as work, or more particularly, not just any work or any action, but they refer particularly to our duty, that is our dharma. Yeah. Now there are different ways in our source book for the practice of karma yoga is the book by the same name, written by Swami Vedarupananda, his lectures in New York City, 1896. And therein he refers to this practice of karma yoga using three interesting expressions. We could say there are three descriptions, three characterizations of this yoga practice of karma yoga. And that is work with detachment, work for work's sake, and work as worship. Each one of these modes of karma yoga aligns with a Jungian character type, that is thinking, feeling, and willing. And they're what I'm calling this morning the knife, the fork, and the spoon of karma yoga. So let's look at those one by one. Analysis of those three different modes of this spiritual practice. First off, work with detachment. It's a form of karma yoga that comes to us directly. It's the direct application of the Vedanta philosophy. As a student of the Vedanta philosophy, it's called practical Vedanta. And we call it the fork, because they call it the knife, because it has a sharp cutting edge, like the sword of discrimination, that enables us to sever our attachment to our karmic actions. As human beings, we have, as it were, two selves, a higher self and a lower self. And in the Upanishads, it asks us to visualize, the Upanishads, Shvetaswatra Upanishad, Katha Upanishad, asks us to visualize a great forest, and in the forest there is a mighty tree. And on that tree there are two birds, a higher bird and a lower bird. The lower bird is hopping around on the branches looking for something, sweet and bitter fruits, finds a particularly sweet fruit, eats that fruit, gets a bitter fruit, and then gets discouraged, looks up to see that on the highest branch of the tree, two birds on the self-same tree, on the highest branch is another bird who's sitting calmly, quietly, surveying the whole forest. The sun is shining, and there he looks on without eating. He's actionless. The lower bird symbolizes our ordinary walking around psychology. That is our ego self. We could say it's the jiva. The higher bird is our true self, our spiritual self, the Atman. The Atman, our true self, is without action. It's the witness of all the events and the activities in our life. It is with this higher self that saints and sages identify themselves, and a sage is called a sage because he is a knower of his higher self, and he abides in his higher self, and even in the midst of activity, he observes like the witness and is actionless. Best example given by the story of the gopis, that is the cowherd girls, who were on pilgrimage to the city of Vrindavan to worship Sri Krishna, and they had in their baskets milk and curd and sweetmeats. And they came to the river Narmada, and they found the river there was in full spate, and there was no bridge, and there was no ferry boat to cross. And what could they do? And then they turned, they looked around, and there what they saw that seated under a tree, there was an old man with a long white beard. And they recognized him immediately as the great sage Vyasa. And so they went over to the sage, "O revered sir, can you help us to cross over this river?" And Vyasa looked at them, and then he looked at their baskets. And he said, well, yes, of course, but I'm very hungry. Could you give me something to eat? Oh, yes. And they opened their baskets, and one by one, he drank the milk, and he ate the curd, and he gobbled up all those sweetmeats. And then he was satisfied. And he stood up, and he looked over at the river. And he said, "Oh, River Narmada, if I have eaten nothing today, then let your waters part." And the River Narmada, hearing those words of the Rishi, the words of the Rishis can never be false. That is, nature has to conform to the statement of the Rishi. And so even if it doesn't want to, the waters parted. And the gopis were able to cross over to the other side and continue their pilgrimage. And so Vyasa represents this ideal of work, intense work. What a great work he did without attachment, as the witness. In the Buddhist tradition, they're very fond of the analogy of the mirror. And the Zen masters tell us that if we are to live in this world, that we ought to employ our mind as a mirror. A mirror, and the karma yogis love this analogy. That's why I'm citing, even though it's a Buddhist analogy. Well, think about a mirror. A mirror does not grasp. It does not take. It receives, but it does not keep. After all, the Veda mirrors everything exactly, reflects what is happening, reflects everything that's happened, but after the events have passed, all that remains is the empty mirror. And so the karma yogi, working with detachment, is the witness. Strives, that's his ideal, is to be the witness of the action. That is to do his work, keeping the knowledge of this Vedanta philosophy tied in your pocket, tied in the corner of their cloth, as they say in India. You don't have a pocket, okay, you tie it in the corner of your cloth, this knowledge of your higher self, though that you do the work. And there's an incident there of the Zen master Tanzan returning to his monastery with his disciple Aikido. And they had journeyed over hill and dale, and finally they came to a stream swiftly flowing like the Narmada. Only this is just a stream. And standing by that stream, there was a girl. She was wearing a beautiful silk kimono with a wide satin sash. She was hesitating. How could she cross over that stream without getting everything all wet and muddy? And she was perplexed as to how to, they came up to the river. Aikido, the disciple, like a good monk, he looked away from the woman. Wasn't correct behavior for a monk to even look at a woman. But what was his surprise when he saw his master, that is Tanzan, walked over to the girl, said, "Hello, girl. What? Oh, I see your problem. Yes, come with me." He scooped her up in his arms, waded across the stream, put her down. She thanked him. And by this time, Aikido crossed, and the two continued on their way in silence. And the sun was shining and the birds were singing, and they walked in silence for a long ways until Aikido finally, his mind was in a great turmoil, and it was a great confusion and anger and bafflement, and he just couldn't contain himself anymore, and he just burst out and he said, "Oh, Master, how could you have done such a thing? How could you have violated all the laws of the monastic life? I'm so disappointed at you. My mind is in such turmoil after having seen what you've done." And the Zen master looked at him and said, "Oh, you mean about that girl back there? Well, I put her down back there. Are you still carrying her?" So the Zen master was able to employ his mind as a mirror. The event came, and it just wouldn't go to God. There's all that remains is the empty mirror. But the disciple, he became attached to the actions that had happened, and thus he fell short of that ideal of work with detachment. Now let's look at another mode of karma yoga, another expression that a different perspective on this practice of karma yoga. And Swami Vivekananda calls it work for work's sake. And the direct reference there is a famous verse in the Bhagavad Gita in the 2nd chapter, where it says, "To work alone you have the right, and not to the fruits thereof." That's the first line of the verse. To work alone you have the right, not to the fruits thereof. And the idea is that whenever we do an action, we are not only attached, but we have a desire to we have a desire for the fruits of the action. And where our minds are focused on the results of the action, and we are motivated by desire to achieve that action. And if we look deeply into our mind, as the Karma yogis tell us, that desire is what binds us. That means that desire is the slave. We think we're acting voluntarily. Not really. We're being driven by the slave master of desire. We have to break that. That's what's forging the link that's binding us. And it would be good for us if we could check that desire and focus not on the end, but on the means of the work. It's okay if you fix your intention about what you're going to do. Obviously, you have to plan your work, determine what you're going to do. Just like, say, you're going to row in a boat across the lake. You would look and you'd look on the farther shore and you'd see the tree there. Yes, I'm going to row over to that tree across the lake. So what you'd do is you'd climb into your boat. You turn your back to the tree and put those oars in hand, and then put your whole back into rowing that boat. And if you row with focus and concentration, then the means of the work, that is, the end will come of itself. You don't have to keep turning around, keep moving around, looking for focusing on the end. Put your focus on the mean. This is why we're calling it the fork. The knife and the fork of karma yoga, because in this kind of mode of karma yoga, we are focusing, that is, focusing on one thing, that is, on the means of the work and not the end. And just like with a fork, you only pick up one thing at a time. You do one thing at a time. And that becomes your meditation. We could call it meditation in action. This is a lesson that Swami Vivekananda, where you can read in Volume 4 of the Complete Works, The Life of Pav Hari Baba, a very inspirational life, an old ancient Indian sage and saint. And one lesson that he learned from Pavhari Baba was to join the end and the means into one. Make the means of work the end. And that's what is called doing the work for the work's sake, not for the personal results and the fruits of the results of the work that will come, which may or may not come in the future, but just for the sake of doing the work for itself. In common parlance, we say, life is a journey. It's not a destination. We say the game, it's not about winning and losing. The game of life is not about winning or losing. It's about how you play the game. That's why you watch the football on the Monday night. Because you don't get the score. You can find the score out in a few seconds after it's over. No, the important thing is the game. Here we're talking about work for work's sake. It's kind of a phrase that you got to kind of think about it and to wrap your brain about what does that mean? Work for work's sake. What they're talking about here is motiveless work. Motiveless work. That means ordinarily when we do our work, we work with a desire for the successful fruit of our action, or we work with a desire to avoid the unpleasant consequences of our action. That is say we have a duty to do, that we may do our duty with anticipating the wonderful good results, or we may be anxious about the consequences of that action. But the teaching here is do your work for work's sake. Do your duty for duty's sake. It's motiveless work. Now today, we are jivas. We can't work without motive. Our highest ideal, that is the best we can hope for, is to get to higher and higher motives. We can purify our work. But the karma yogis say even that's not enough. The highest ideal is to work without any motive at all. Swami Vivekananda tells the story about the mongoose. Now, a mongoose is a little carnivorous mammal that's native to India. And he appeared one day in the court of Sri Rama, and half of his body was golden. And everyone in the court was curious. So what happened? Why is this? What happened? Could you tell us your story? Yes, he said, let me tell you how this happened. And I was out looking for food one day. I went through the forest. I came upon a farm. There's a farmhouse. I went over to the farmhouse and I looked in the window. And there in the window, I saw that there was a farmer and his wife and his 2 children. And they were sitting down to have their supper. And each one of them had before them a very humble leaf plate. And on that leaf plate, each one had 1 little teaspoon of rice. That's all they had. They were so poor. But they sat down and the family, they said grace. And no sooner had they finished saying their grace than they heard a knock at the door. And there was a guest at the door, a traveler. Now, in old India, the tradition is that if a guest arrives at the door of a dharmic householder, that guest has got to be welcomed like it's like a visitation of the gods. We have to welcome that guest and entertain whatever he wants. Yes, please come in, sir. He said, please sit down here, sir. Are you hungry? Have you had your supper? No, he said, I'm very hungry. So the father said, no problem. Here, she says, take this rice, have this rice. Well, he ate that rice. So that wasn't very much, and the wife saw that he was still hungry. She gave him her rice also. And he ate that up. And so the children, too, followed suit. They gave them the children, seeing as their parents had done, gave them their little rice, and the guest ate all that, like vyasa. But now here's different, because the guest ate all of that, of those things. The guest here is dharma in disguise, you see. But he ate all that. Oh, thank you very much. And he took his leave. And that night, well, they were already had nothing to eat. And it's terrible to say that night the whole family died of starvation. Now all this, the mongoose is looking outside the window. He's watching all this. He saw all this happen. And after it was all, he crawled through that window and looked around, and he rolled his body in the dust underneath that table, and half his body turned golden. And that was the story that he told in the court of Sri Rama. And he said, I've been traveling over the whole of India since that time, looking for another sacrifice. A similar sacrifice that would turn the other half of my body golden, but I have never found it. So that's the story of the mongoose, and how the family did their duty for duty's sake, regardless of the consequences. Now you may say, well, that. What kind of a story is that? He says, you're saying that we ought to starve ourselves to death for a guest, sacrifice our lives and our children? Is this what that means? Well, you see, we can't. This is an ideal. It's an otherworldly, it sounds almost superhuman. It sounds only inhuman to do such a thing. And it is. That's why it is an ideal. It's like a distant star in the heavens, that we're supposed to look up to the high ideal. Doesn't mean that we're going to sacrifice our lives and our family. But the ideal is to do your dharma without any regard for the results of the action, be they whether benefit you or they are terrible results. Now, ordinary people cannot. That's an ideal. We can't hardly do this. Has anyone actually done this? And Swami Vedarupananda describes for us very well in Karma Yoga, yes, that there is one person in the history of mankind who has actually practiced this. And this was Lord Buddha. Now, if you look down through the history of the great saints and sages, we find generally it's true that all of them find inspiration. All the prophets of the world have gotten their inspiration from something outside. That is, some prophets get their inspiration from God, and the idea that God has created this world and that we ought to work in order to make this world a better place to live, and we ought to serve God. But Buddha didn't believe in God. All their prophets are inspired by high metaphysical ideals, by great philosophy, by the idea of the universal spirit in everything, the spirit within us, that we ought to work to worship the spirit by the spirit, and to realize and identify with our true nature, our soul. But Buddha didn't believe in a soul. He didn't believe that we had a spiritual self, that there was some kind of a universal spirit that pervades all things. And yet, he was the most moral of men. He gave his life 500 times to save many different creatures. And the idea is that if we can remove our ego from the work, we too, like Buddha, if we could remove our ego from the equation here, that is the source of the desire for the fruits of the action is what? It's just our identification with our ego self, our self-limited separate self. If we could eliminate the ego from our actions, then we too could become Buddhas. And that's the ideal of doing your work for work's sake. So that was the second description. We're going to talk here about 3 different perspectives on karma yoga, 3 different expressions. Work with detachment, that's one. We look at it from a little different point of view. We can see work for work's sake, the purest form of karma yoga. It doesn't require that you study philosophy. It doesn't require you know anything about Vedanta. All you have to do is your own ordinary quotidian activities of life, the things that you do every day, washing dishes every day, that kind of thing every day, it enables you to realize the highest ideal. So that's the work for work's sake. Now let's look at the third mode of karma yoga. Karma yoga is a way of spiritualizing everyday life, but there's just little different perspectives of ways of looking at it. Another perspective here is captured by the phrase, work as worship. Now, in this description of karma yoga, we bring Ishvara into the picture. That is, God now comes into the picture. And I call it the spoon because this is maybe it's the easiest way of doing karma yoga. You think of a baby being fed with a silver spoon. It's so natural for the curvature of that. Baby can't use a fork or a knife. No, he has to use a spoon. That means that it's natural for us to believe that the basic natural human belief is believing in God. Everybody believes in God. And therefore, it's natural for us to use this idea, this natural belief, in order to do our work as worship. Now, when we think here of bhakti yoga. We think here of doing a worship. When we think of worship, we think about a shrine. We think about a temple and a shrine room, and we think about someone seated before an image, a picture, a deity in the shrine, offering incense and offering fruits and flowers, maybe a little water to that image on the shrine. And as a result of which they have a feeling of devotion arises in the mind. Their mind is uplifted. And it's natural that such a devotee, that when he leaves the shrine room behind, and he carries the image of God in that is his Ishta Devata, in the image of his heart, in the cave of his heart, it's naturally that when he leaves the shrine room, he's going to want to continue on in that devotional attitude. And in fact, Sri Krishna tells us in the Bhagavad Gita that yes, a man attains to achieve perfection if you can do your work as worship, if you can remember me, and if you can devote all of your activities during the day to me. That is Sri Krishna speaking as the incarnation of God to the devotee. Now the tool of this mode of karma yoga. See, each mode has a instrumental function that we can facilitates the action. In the first work with detachment, it is our knowledge about the truths of Vedanta. That's where we're applying that knowledge. In doing work for work's sake, we're using our will. That's where we're withdrawing our attention. We're controlling. It's kind of like controlling our mind and our attention, putting our attention fully on the work at hand and withdrawing it from other things. Here, however, the tool is a little different. The tool is the offertory prayer. Now, whenever you do, the idea is when doing work is worship, whenever you undertake an activity, let's say that you've blocked out your day, you have one little activity. Before you begin that activity, you offer it to God, that is, to your chosen deity. And at the end of the completion of that activity, when the karmic cycle is finished, then again you bring it to mind, recall what you've done, and offer that fruits to God. And there was a great devotee in ancient India. His name was Narada. Narada is like an eternal sage. He wanders the earth for hundreds and hundreds of years. And what he does is think about Narayana, that is Lord Vishnu, and repeats the name of God all day long. And then he sings his glories. And on one occasion, Narada, the great saint, he went up to Vaikuntha and the heaven of Lord Vishnu, and which he worshipped in the form of Sri Krishna. And he says, well, Lord, he says, tell me, who is your greatest devotee? Expecting, of course, that it would be himself. Oh, well, said Sri Krishna, well, okay, come with me, I'll show you. And they teleport through the air, they teleport through the sky, and they come to a farmhouse. And they're hovering above the farmhouse up in the clouds, and they look down, and there they see. Now it's early, the sun has, before the rising of the sun, the farmer gets up, and he goes to the door of his little shrine, and with folded hands he offers, Lord, I offer the fruits of my work today to you. So saying, he goes out. He did all his chores early morning, returned a little later to have breakfast with his wife and his family. Then he went out in the fields, worked all day in the fields, came back, he had lunch, and they went all afternoon he worked in the fields, came back and he had supper. And then just before he retired for the night, he passed by that little shrine room again. He stopped and with folded hands, he said, Lord, I offer everything that I've done to you today. And Sri Krishna, up in the sky there with Narada, he said, you see that guy? He's my greatest devotee. And Narada looked, what? He said, well, but sir, he only thought about you twice during the day. Yeah, I said, that's true. Oh, by the way, Narada, he said, I have a job for you. If you could, I have this bowl here full of milk, filled up to the very brim. I wonder if you could carry this bowl around the earth for me in return without spilling a drop. And Narada said, no problem, Lord. Of course I will do that for you. And he took that bowl of milk and he focused. He was very careful not to spill anything. And he set off on his journey. And because he was such a great saint, he just made the whole circuit in one day. At the end of the day, he came back and he brought that bowl. And he says, "Lord, here it is. I've done what you asked me." And Sri Krishna looked at that bowl of milk. "Yes, you did very good. By the way," he said, "how often did you think about me today?" And Narada thinks back, "Oh, well, my whole mind said I was so worried about spilling anything out of the bowl of the milk." He said, I couldn't think of you at all." "Oh, is that so?" said Sri Krishna. "Well, at least that farmer, who also had a day full of intense activities, at least he thought about me twice. And you didn't think about me at all." And so like this, Narada learned the lesson of devotional karma yoga, that is, doing work as worship. Now, in this form of work as doing work as worship, when we think about worship, we think about what is worship. Worship just means is that we express our devotion to God through some kind of a ritual. And the idea here in karma yoga is that everything in our life, using that analogy, the analogy of the ritualistic worship, that everything in our life can be understood as a kind of a ritual that enables us to focus our mind on God. And for example, let's say that you're going to make supper for your family, and you go into the kitchen. Well, the kitchen is kind of like your shrine room, you could think. And you get out some pots, and you get some pans and some utensils. Yeah, these are the utensils of worship. And then you get out the recipe books. You look at the recipe, yeah, just like the scripture. You have to follow the scripture in order to do the ritual in the proper manner. And so you're following those directions. One by one, the ingredients, just like in the shrine, you'd offer one ingredient and the other. Final ingredient is TLC, tender, loving care, that you put into the food. And then when you've finished, you've prepared now your offering. And you can offer that food which you've prepared to the God that's dwelling in the hearts of all of the members of your family. And so in such a way, you've done, that's karma yoga. That's what it means to do work as worship. I remember we had in our monastery in San Francisco, we had a big a book that was published by the New York Graphic Arts Society. It was entitled Work and Worship. Now, karma yoga is work as worship. The title of this book was Work and Worship. But it was a book about the community of the Shaker community. The Shakers are kind of like Quakers, but they're not really Quakers. But they settled in New England, and this community had as their motto, give your heart to God and your hand to work. That was their motto. And everything that they did, everything was handmade. And everything that they did with the great devotion as a spiritual practice, basically. And they made their own clothes. They made a lot of their parts, their machinery and their shovels. And then, of course, they made furniture and their tables and chairs. And now today that community is long gone. But the artifacts still remain in museums. And they're objects of the great collectors of antiques are eager to collect those antique things that are made by the Shakers. Because as we look through that book, you can see why these are aesthetic objects. That is, they have a kind of an elegant simplicity. They have a kind of a very simple practicality, a purity to them that kind of reminds you of a religious object. And yeah, that's because they did their work as worship, and because it found their devotion found expression in what they did. And so I thought that was a good example of work as worship. In Indian history, the ideal of this form of this mode of karma yoga is the ideal of the servant ideal. The ideal of the, they say that that in doing spiritual life, that however much that we work, however much spiritual practice we do, Sri Ramakrishna tells us, you can never really get rid of the ego. The ego will always come back in some form or other, and therefore, Sri Ramakrishna says, let it remain. Let it remain, though, as the ego of the jnani or the ego of the devotee. That is the servant ego. And thus it won't do us any harm. Now, the ideal of the servant of God in ancient India was the great monkey god Hanuman. He was a devotee of Lord Rama, the incarnation of Vishnu. In his whole life, he worked everything that he did in service of Vishnu. That was his bhava. That is, he was the Lord, the bhava here, the relationship. It's not friend and friend. It's not mother and daughter, mother and child, or father and child. It's servant and master. That's the bhava. And Hanuman is the great servant. And then, as we see, he was like a superhero. And he was a superhero because if we serve ourselves and work for our own personal goals, that we have a certain amount of prana, a certain amount of energy. But if we were to work for a very rich man,